You didn't tell her? Penelope Bridgerton would have said more, and, in fact, would have liked to say more, but words were difficult, what with her mouth hanging slack. Her husband had just returned from a mad dash across the south of England with his 3 brothers, in pursuit of his sister Eloise, who had, by all accounts, run off to— "Oh, dear God! Is she married?" Penelope asked frantically. Colin tossed his hat on a chair with a clever little twist of his wrist, one corner of his mouth lifting in a satisfied smile as it spun through the air on a perfect horizontal axis. "Not yet," he replied. So she hadn't eloped, but she had run away, and she'd done it in secret. Eloise, who was Penelope's closest friend. Eloise, who told Penelope everything. Eloise, who apparently didn't tell Penelope everything, had run off to the home of a man none of them knew, leaving a note assuring her family that all would be well and not to worry. Not to worry? Good heavens, one would think Eloise Bridgerton knew her family better than that. They had been frantic, every last one of them. Penelope had stayed with her new mother-in-law while the men were searching for Eloise. Violet Bridgerton had put up a good front, but her skin was positively ashen, and Penelope could not help but notice the way her hands shook with every movement. And now Colin was back, acting as if nothing were amiss, answering none of her questions to her satisfaction. And beyond all that, "How could you not have told her?" she said again, dogging his heels. He sprawled into a chair and shrugged. "There really wasn't an appropriate time. You were gone 5 days. Yes, well, not all of them were with Eloise. A day's travel on either end, after all." But Colin summoned just enough energy to glance about the room. "Don't suppose you ordered tea?" "Yes, of course," Penelope said reflexively, since it had not taken more than a week of marriage to learn that when it came to her new husband, it was always best to have food at the ready. "But, Colin, I did hurry back, you know." "I can see that," she said, taking in his dampened, wind-blown hair. "Did you ride?" He nodded. "From Gloucestershire. Wiltshire, actually. We retired to Benedict's. But," he smiled disarmingly, "I missed you." And Penelope was not so accustomed to his affection that she did not blush. "I missed you too. But come sit with me." "Where?" Penelope almost demanded, because the only flat surface was his lap. His smile, which had been charm personified, grew more heated. "I'm missing you right now," he murmured. Much to her extreme embarrassment, her gaze moved instantly to the front of his breeches. Colin let out a bark of laughter, and Penelope crossed her arms. "Don't, Colin," she warned. "Don't what?" he asked, all innocence. "Even if we weren't in the sitting-room, and even if the draperies weren't open. An easily remedied nuisance," he commented with a glance to the windows. "And even," she ground out, her voice growing in depth, if not quite in volume, "were we not expecting a maid to enter at any moment, the poor thing staggering under the weight of your tea-tray. The fact of the matter is," Colin let out a sigh, "you have not answered my question." He blinked. "I've quite forgotten what it was." A full 10 seconds elapsed before she spoke. And then, "I'm going to kill you." "Of that I'm certain," he said offhandedly. "Truly, the only question is when." "Colin!" "Might be sooner rather than later," he murmured. "But in truth I thought I'd go in an apoplexy, brought on by bad behavior." She stared at him. "Your bad behavior," he clarified. "I didn't have bad behavior before I met you," she retorted. "Oh, ho, ho," he chortled. "Now that is rich." And Penelope was forced to shut her mouth. Because, blast it all, he was right. And that was what all of this was about, as it happened. Her husband, after entering the hall, shrugging off his coat, and kissing her rather soundly on the lips, in front of the butler, had blithely informed her, "Oh, and by the by, I never did tell her you were Whistledown." And if there was anything that might count as bad behavior, it had to be 10 years as the author of the now infamous Lady Whistledown society papers. Over the past decade, Penelope had, in her pseudonymous guise, managed to insult just about everyone in society, even herself. Surely, the town would have grown suspicious if she had never poked fun at herself. And besides, she really did look like an overripe citrus fruit in the dreadful yellows and oranges her mother had always forced her to wear. Penelope had retired just before her marriage, but a blackmail attempt had convinced Colin that the best course of action was to reveal her secret in a grand gesture, and so he had announced her identity at his sister Daphne's ball. It had all been very romantic and very, well, grand, but by the end of the night it had become apparent that Eloise had disappeared. Eloise had been Penelope's closest friend for years, but even she had not known Penelope's big secret, and now she still didn't. She'd left the party before Colin had announced it, and he apparently had not seen fit to say anything once he'd found her. Frankly, Colin said, his voice holding an uncharacteristic strain of irritability, "It's less than she deserved after what she put us through." "Well, yes," Penelope murmured, feeling rather disloyal even as she said it. But the entire Bridgerton clan had been mad with worry. Eloise had left a note, it was true, but it had somehow got mixed into her mother's correspondence, and an entire day had passed before the family was reassured that Eloise had not been abducted. And even then, no one's mind was set at ease. Eloise might have left of her own accord, but it took another day of tearing her bedchamber to bits before they found a letter from Sir Philip Crane that indicated where she might have run off to. Considering all that, Colin did have something of a point. "We have to go back in a few days," he said. "Well, tell her then." "Oh, but we can't." He paused. Then he smiled. "And why is that?" he asked, his eyes resting on her with great appreciation. "It will be her wedding day," Penelope explained, aware that he'd been hoping for a far more diabolical reason. "She must be the center of all attention. A bit more altruistic than I'd like," he mused, "but the end result is the same, so you have my approval." "I don't need your approval," Penelope cut in. "But nonetheless, you have it," he said smoothly. "We shall keep Eloise in the dark." He tapped his fingertips together and sighed with audible pleasure. "It will be a most excellent wedding." The maid arrived just then, carrying a heavily laden tea-tray. Penelope tried not to notice that she let out a little grunt when she was finally able to set it down. "You may close the door behind you," Colin said, once the maid had straightened. Penelope's eyes darted to the door, then to her husband, who had risen and was shutting the draperies. "Colin!" she yelped, because his arms had stolen around her, and his lips were on her neck, and she could feel herself going quite liquid in his embrace. "I thought you wanted food," she gasped. "I do," he murmured, tugging on the bodice of her dress. "But I want you more." They came together in passion. Several days later, Penelope was seated in a carriage, gazing out the window and scolding herself. Colin was asleep. She was a widgeon for feeling so nervous about seeing Eloise again. Eloise, for heaven's sake! They had been as close as sisters for over a decade. Closer, except maybe not quite as close as either had thought. They had kept secrets, both of them. Penelope wanted to wring Eloise's neck for not telling her about her suitor, but really she hadn't a leg to stand on. When Eloise found out that Penelope was Lady Whistledown, Penelope shuddered. Colin might be looking forward to the moment. He was positively devilish in his glee. But she felt rather ill, quite frankly. She hadn't eaten all day, and she was not the sort to skip breakfast. She wrung her hands, craned her neck to get a better view out the windows. She thought they might have turned onto the drive for Romney Hall, but she wasn't precisely certain. Then looked back to Colin. He was still asleep. She kicked him. Gently, of course, because she did not think herself overly violent, but really it wasn't fair that he had slept like a baby from the moment the carriage had started rolling. He had settled into his seat, inquired after her comfort, then, before she'd even managed the "you" in "very well, thank you," his eyes were closed. 30 seconds later he was snoring. It really wasn't fair. He always fell asleep before she did at night as well. She kicked him again, harder this time. He mumbled something in his sleep, shifted positions ever so slightly, and slumped into the corner. Penelope scooted over. Closer, closer. Then she organized her elbow in a sharp point and jabbed him in the ribs. What? Colin shot straight awake, blinking and coughing. What? I think we're here, Penelope said. He looked out the window, then back at her. And you needed to inform of this by taking a weapon to my body? It was my elbow. He glanced down at her arm. You, my dear, are in possession of exceedingly bony elbows. Penelope was quite sure her elbows, or any part of her for that matter, were not the least bit bony. But there seemed little to gain by contradicting him, so she said, again, I think we're here. Colin leaned toward the glass with a couple of sleepy blinks. I think you're right. It's lovely, Penelope said, taking in the exquisitely maintained grounds. Why did you tell me it was run down? It is, Colin replied, handing her her shawl. Here, he said with a gruff smile, as if he weren't yet used to caring for another person's welfare in quite the way he did hers. It will be chilly yet. It was still fairly early in the morning. The inn at which they had slept was only an hour's ride away. Most of the family had stayed with Benedict and Sophie, but their home was not large enough to accommodate all of the Bridgertons. Besides, Colin had explained, they were newlyweds. They needed their privacy. Penelope hugged the soft wool to her body and leaned against him to get a better look out the window. And, to be honest, just because she liked to lean against him. I think it looks lovely, she said. I have never seen such roses. It's nicer on the outside than in, Colin explained, as the carriage drew to a halt. But I expect Eloise will change that. He opened the door himself and hopped out, then offered his arm to assist her down. Come along, Lady Whistledown. Mrs. Bridgerton, she corrected. Whatever you wish to call yourself, he said with a grand smile, you're still mine. And this is your swan song. As Colin stepped across the threshold of what was to be his sister's new home, he was struck by a sense of relief that was as unsurprising as it was unexpected. For all his irritation with her, he loved his sister. They had not been particularly intimate while growing up. He had been much closer in age to Daphne, and Eloise had often seemed nothing so much as a pesky afterthought. But the previous year had brought them closer. And if it hadn't been for Eloise, he might never have discovered Penelope. And without Penelope, it was funny. He couldn't imagine what he'd be without her. He looked down at his new wife. She was glancing around the entry hall, trying not to be too obvious about it. Her face was impassive, but he knew she was taking everything in. And tomorrow, when they were musing about the events of the day, she would have remembered every last detail. Mind like an elephant, she had. He loved it. Mr. Bridgerton, the butler said, greeting them with a little nod, welcome back to Romney Hall. A pleasure, Gunning murmured. So sorry about the last time. Penelope looked to him askance. We entered rather suddenly, Colin explained. The butler must have seen Penelope's expression of alarm, because he quickly added, I stepped out of the way. Oh, she started to say. Sir Philip did not, Gunning cut in. Oh, Penelope coughed awkwardly. Is he going to be all right? Bit of swelling around the throat, Colin said, unconcerned. I expect he's improved by now. He caught her glancing down at his hands and let out a chuckle. Oh, it wasn't I, he said, taking her arm to lead her down the hall. She grimaced. I think that might be worse. Quite possibly, he said with great cheer, but it all turned out well in the end. I quite like the fellow now, and Mother, there you are. And sure enough, Violet Bridgerton was bustling down the hall. You're late, she said, even though Colin was fairly certain they were not. He bent down to kiss her proffered cheek, then stepped to the side as his mother came forward to take both of Penelope's hands in hers. My dear, we need you in back. You are her main attendant, after all. Colin had a sudden vision of the scene, a gaggle of chatty females, all talking over one another about minutiae he couldn't begin to care about, much less understand. They told each other everything, and, he turned sharply. Don't, he warned, say a word. I beg your pardon. Penelope let out a little huff of righteous indignation. I'm the one who said we couldn't tell her on her wedding day. I was talking to my mother, he said. Violet shook her head. Eloise is going to kill us. She nearly killed us already, running off like an idiot, Colin said, with uncharacteristic shortness of temper. I've already instructed the others to keep their mouths shut. Even Hyacinth? Penelope asked doubtfully. Especially Hyacinth. Did you bribe her? Violet asked, because it won't work unless you bribe her. Good Lord, Colin muttered. One would think I'd joined this family yesterday. Of course I bribed her. He turned to Penelope. No offense to recent additions. Oh, none taken, she said. What did you give her? He thought about his bargaining session with his youngest sister and nearly shuddered. 20 pounds! 20 pounds! Violet exclaimed. Are you mad? I suppose you could have done better, he retorted. And I've only given her half. I wouldn't trust that girl as far as I could throw her. But if she keeps her mouth shut, I'll be another 10 pounds poorer. I wonder how far you could throw her, Penelope mused. Colin turned to his mother. I tried for 10, but she wouldn't budge. Then to Penelope. Not nearly far enough. Violet sighed. I ought to scold you for that. But you won't, Colin flashed her a grin. Heaven help me, was her only reply. Heaven help whatever chap is mad enough to marry her, he remarked. I think there is more to Hyacinth than the two of you allow, Penelope put in. You ought not to underestimate her. Good Lord, Colin replied, we don't do that. You're so sweet, Violet said, leaning forward to give Penelope an impromptu hug. It's only through sheer force of luck she hasn't taken over the world, Colin muttered. Ignore him, Violet said to Penelope. And you, she added, turning to Colin, must head immediately to the church. The rest of the men have already gone down. It's only a 5-minute walk. You're planning to walk? He asked doubtfully. Of course not, his mother replied dismissively. And we certainly cannot spare a carriage for you. I wouldn't dream of asking for one, Colin replied, deciding that a solitary stroll through the fresh morning air was decidedly preferable to a closed carriage with his female relations. He leaned down to kiss his wife's cheek, right near her ear. Remember, he whispered, no telling. I can keep a secret, she replied. It's far easier to keep a secret from 1,000 people than it is from just one, he said. Far less guilt involved. Her cheeks flushed, and he kissed her again near her ear. I know you so well, he murmured. He could practically hear her teeth gashing as he left.
Penelope! Eloise started to jump from her seat to greet her, but Hyacinth, who was supervising the dressing of her hair, jammed her hand on her shoulder with a low, almost menacing down. And Eloise, who normally would have slain Hyacinth with a glare, meekly resumed her seat. Penelope looked to Daphne, who appeared to be supervising Hyacinth. "It has been a long morning," Daphne said. Penelope walked forward, pushed gently past Hyacinth, and carefully embraced Eloise so as not to muss her coiffure. "You look beautiful," she said. "Thank you," Eloise replied, but her lips were trembling and her eyes were wet and threatening to spill over at any moment. More than anything, Penelope wanted to take her aside and tell her that everything was going to be all right, and she didn't have to marry Sir Philip if she didn't want to. But when all was said and done, Penelope didn't know that everything was going to be all right, and she rather suspected that Eloise did have to marry her Sir Philip. She'd heard bits and pieces. Eloise had been in residence at Romney Hall for over a week without a chaperone. Her reputation would be in tatters if it got out, which it surely would. Penelope knew better than anyone the power and tenacity of gossip. Plus, Penelope had heard that Anthony had had a talk. The matter of the wedding, it seemed, was final. "I'm so glad you're here," Eloise said. "Goodness, you know I would never miss your wedding." "I know." Eloise's lips trembled, and her face took on that expression one makes when one is trying to appear brave and actually thinks one might be succeeding. "I know," she said again, a little more evenly. "Of course you wouldn't. But that does not lessen my pleasure in seeing you." It was an oddly stiff sentence for Eloise, and for a moment Penelope forgot her own secrets, her own fears and worries. Eloise was her dearest friend. Colin was her love, her passion, and her soul, but it was Eloise, more than anyone, who had shaped Penelope's adult life. Penelope could not imagine what the last decade would have been like without Eloise's smile, her laughter, and her indefatigable good cheer. Even more than her own family, Eloise had loved her. "Eloise," Penelope said, crouching down beside her so that she might put her arm around her shoulders. She cleared her throat, mostly because she was about to ask a question for which the answer probably did not matter. "Eloise," she said again, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you want this?" "Of course," Eloise replied, but Penelope wasn't sure she believed her. "Do you—" She caught herself, and she did that little thing with her mouth that tried to be a smile, and she asked, "Do you like him, your Sir Philip?" Eloise nodded. "He's complicated," which made Penelope sit down. "You're joking? At a time like this? Aren't you the one who always said that men were simple creatures?" Eloise looked at her with an oddly helpless expression. "I thought they were." Penelope leaned in, aware that Hyacinth's auditory skills were positively canine. "Does he like you?" "He thinks I talk too much." "You do talk too much," Penelope replied. Eloise shot her a look. "You could at least smile. It's the truth. But I find it endearing. I think he does as well." Eloise grimaced. "Some of the time." "Eloise," called Violet from the doorway, "we really must be on our way." "We wouldn't want the groom to think you've run off," Hyacinth quipped. Eloise stood and straightened her shoulders. "I've done quite enough running off recently, wouldn't you say?" She turned to Penelope with a wise, wistful smile. "It's time I began running too, and stopped running from." Penelope looked at her curiously. "What did you say?" But Eloise only shook her head. "It's just something I heard recently." It was a curious statement, but this wasn't the time to delve further, so Penelope moved to follow the rest of the family. After she'd taken a few steps, however, she was halted by the sound of Eloise's voice. "Penelope!" Penelope turned. Eloise was still in the doorway, a good 10 feet behind her. She had an odd look on her face, one that Penelope could not quite interpret. Penelope waited, but Eloise did not speak. "Eloise," Penelope said quietly, because it looked as if Eloise wished to say something, just wasn't sure how. Or possibly what? And then, "I'm sorry," Eloise blurted it out, the words rushing across her lips with a speed that was remarkable, even for her. "You're sorry?" Penelope echoed, mostly out of surprise. She hadn't really considered what Eloise might say in that moment, but an apology would not have topped the list. For what? For keeping secrets. That wasn't well done of me. Penelope swallowed. "Good Lord! Forgive me." Eloise's voice was soft, but her eyes were urgent, and Penelope felt like the worst sort of fraud. "Of course," she stammered, "it is nothing." And it was nothing, at least when compared to her own secrets. "I should have told you about my correspondence with Sir Philip. I don't know why I didn't at the outset," Eloise continued. "But then, later, when you and Colin were falling in love, I think it was just because it was mine." Penelope nodded. She knew a great deal about wanting something of one's own. Eloise let out a nervous laugh. "And now look at me." Penelope did. "You look beautiful." It was the truth. Eloise was not a serene bride, but she was a glowing one, and Penelope felt her worries lift and lighten and finally disappear. All would be well. Penelope did not know if Eloise would experience the same bliss in her marriage as she'd found, but she would at least be happy and content. And who was she to say that the new married couple wouldn't fall madly in love? Stranger things had happened. She linked her arm through Eloise's and steered her out into the hall, where Violet had raised her voice to hitherto unimagined volumes. "I think your mother wants us to make haste," Penelope whispered. "Eloise!" Violet positively bellowed. "Now!" Eloise's brows rose as she gave Penelope a sideways glance. "Whatever makes you think so." But they didn't hurry. Arm in arm they glided down the hall as if it were the church aisle. "Who would have thought we'd marry within months of each other?" Penelope mused. "Weren't we meant to be old crones together?" "We can still be old crones," Eloise replied gaily. "We shall simply be married old crones. It will be grand, magnificent, stupendous. We shall be leaders of crone fashion, arbiters of cronish taste." "What," Hyacinth demanded, hands on hips, "are the two of you talking about?" Eloise lifted her chin and looked down her nose at her. "You're far too young to understand." And she and Penelope practically collapsed in a fit of giggles. "They've gone mad, Mother," Hyacinth announced. Violet gazed lovingly at her daughter, and daughter-in-law, both of whom had reached the unfashionable age of 28 before becoming brides. "Leave them alone, Hyacinth," she said, steering her toward the waiting carriage. "They'll be along shortly." And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You're too young to understand." After the ceremony, after the reception, and after Colin was able to assure himself, once and for all, that Sir Philip Crane would indeed make an acceptable husband to his sister, he managed to find a quiet corner into which he could yank his wife and speak with her privately. "Does she suspect?" he asked, grinning. "You're terrible," Penelope replied. "It's her wedding," which was not one of the two customary answers to a yes or no question. Colin resisted the urge to let out an impatient breath, and instead offered a rather smooth and urbane, "By this you mean?" Penelope stared at him for a full 10 seconds. Then she muttered, "I don't know what Eloise was talking about. Men are abysmally simple creatures." "Well, yes," Colin agreed, since it had long been obvious to him that the female mind was an utter and complete mystery. "But what has that got to do with anything?" Penelope glanced over both shoulders before dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. Why would she even be thinking about Whistledown at a time like this? She had a point there, loath as Colin was to admit it. In his mind, this had all played out with Eloise somehow being aware that she was the only person who didn't know the secret of Lady Whistledown's identity. which was ridiculous to be sure, but still a satisfying daydream. He said. Penelope looked at him suspiciously. What are you thinking? Are you certain we cannot tell her on her wedding day? Colin, because if we don't, she's sure to find out from someone, and it doesn't seem fair that we not be present to see her face. Colin, no. After all you've been through, wouldn't you say you deserve to see her reaction? No, Penelope said slowly. No, I wouldn't. Oh, you sell yourself too cheaply, my darling, he said, smiling benevolently at her. And besides that, think of Eloise. I fail to see what else it is I have been doing all morning. He shook his head. She would be devastated, hearing the awful truth from a complete stranger. It's not awful, Penelope shot back. And how do you know it would be a stranger? We've sworn my entire family to secrecy. Who else does she know out in this God-forsaken county? I rather like Gloucestershire, Penelope said, her teeth now charmingly clenched. I find it delightful. Yes, he said equably, taking in her furrowed brow, pinched mouth, and narrowed eyes. You look delighted. Weren't you the one who insisted we keep her in the dark for as long as humanly possible? Humanly possible being the phrase of note, Colin replied. This human, he gestured rather unnecessarily to himself, finding it quite impossible to maintain his silence. I can't believe you've changed your mind. He shrugged. Isn't it a man's prerogative? At that, her lips parted, and Colin found himself wishing he'd found a corner as private as it was quiet, because she was practically begging to be kissed, whether she knew it or not. But he was a patient man, and they did still have that comfortable room reserved at the inn, and there was still much to anticipate right here at the wedding. Oh, Penelope, he said huskily, leaning in, don't you want to share some moments? She flushed scarlet. Perhaps later. He laughed aloud at that. I meant something else, she muttered. Neither was I, as a matter of fact, he returned, completely unable to keep the humor off his face. But I am pleased by your quick thoughts. He pretended to glance about the room. When do you think it would be polite to leave? Definitely not yet. He pretended to ponder. Yes, you're probably correct at that. Pity. But, at that, he pretended to brighten. It does leave us time for other plans. Again, she was speechless. He liked that. Shall we? He murmured. I don't know what I'm going to do with you. We need to work on this, he said, giving his head a shake. I'm not sure you fully understand the mechanics of a yes or no question. I think you should sit down, she said, her eyes now taking on that glint of cautious exhaustion usually reserved for small children, or adult fools. And then, she continued, I think you should remain in your seat. Indefinitely? Yes. Just to torture her, he sat, and then, no, I think I'd rather pursue my plans. Back to his feet he was, and striding off to find Eloise before Penelope could even attempt to lunch for him. Colin, don't, she called out, her voice echoing off the walls of the reception room. She managed to yell, of course, at the precise moment when every other wedding guest paused to take a breath. A room full of Bridgertons. What were the odds? Penelope jammed a smile on her face as she watched 24 heads swivel in her direction. Nothing about it, she said, her voice coming out strangled and chirpy. So sorry to disturb. And apparently Colin's family was well used to his embarking on something requiring the rejoinder, Colin, don't, because they all resumed their conversations with barely another glance in her direction. Except Hyacinth. Oh, gosh, Penelope muttered under her breath, and she raced forward. But Hyacinth was quick. What's going on? She asked, following into stride beside Penelope with remarkable agility. Nothing, Penelope replied, because the last thing she wanted was Hyacinth adding to the disaster. He's going to tell her, isn't he? Hyacinth persisted, letting out an oomph and an excuse me when she pushed past one of her brothers. No, Penelope said firmly, darting around Daphne's children. He's not. He is. Penelope actually stopped for a moment and turned. Do any of you ever listen to anyone? Not me, Hyacinth said cheerfully. Penelope shook her head and moved forward, Hyacinth hot on her heels. When she reached Colin, he was standing next to the newlyweds and had his arm linked through Eloise's and was smiling down at her as if he had never once considered A. teaching her to swim by tossing her in a lake, B. cutting off 3 inches of her hair while she slept, or C. tying her to a tree so that she did not follow him to a local public inn. Which, of course, he had, all 3 of them, and 2 he'd actually done. Even Colin wouldn't have dared something so permanent as a shearing. Eloise, Penelope said, somewhat breathless from trying to shake off Hyacinth. Penelope. But Eloise's voice sounded curious, which did not surprise Penelope. Eloise was no fool, and she was well aware that her brother's normal modes of behavior did not include beatific smiles in her direction. Eloise, Hyacinth said, for no reason Penelope could deduce. Hyacinth. Penelope turned to her husband. Colin. He looked amused. Penelope. Hyacinth. Hyacinth grinned. Colin. And then Sir Philip. Ladies. Sir Philip, it seemed, favored brevity. Stop! Eloise burst out. What is going on? A recitation of our Christian names, apparently, Hyacinth said. Penelope has something to say to you, Colin said. I don't. She does. I do, Penelope said, thinking quickly. She rushed forward, taking Eloise's hands in her own. Congratulations! I'm so happy for you. That's what you needed to say? Eloise asked. Yes. No. And from Hyacinth, I am enjoying myself immensely. It's very kind of you to say so, Sir Philip said, looking a bit perplexed at her sudden need to compliment the host. Penelope closed her eyes for a brief moment and let out a weary sigh. She was going to need to take the poor man aside and instruct him on the finer points of marrying into the Bridgerton family. And because she did know her new relation so well, and she knew that there was no way she was going to avoid revealing her secret, she turned to Eloise and said, Might I have a moment alone? With me? It was enough to make Penelope wish to strangle someone. Anyone. Yes, she said patiently, with you. And me, Colin put in. And me, Hyacinth added. Not you, Penelope said, not bothering to look at her. But still me, Colin added, looping his free arm through Penelope's. Can this wait? Sir Philip asked politely. This is her wedding day, and I expect that she does not wish to miss it. I know, Penelope said wearily. I'm so sorry. It's all right, Eloise said, breaking free of Colin's grasp and turning to her new husband. She murmured a few words to him that Penelope could not hear, then said, There is a small salon just through that door. Shall we? She led the way, which suited Penelope because it gave her time to say to Colin, You will say nothing. He surprised her by nodding, and then, maintaining his silence, he held open the door for her as she entered the room behind Eloise. This won't take long, Penelope said apologetically. At least I hope it won't. Eloise said nothing, just looked at her with an expression that was, Penelope had just enough presence of mind to notice, uncharacteristically serene. Marriage must agree with her, Penelope thought, because the Eloise she knew would have been chomping at the bit at such a moment. A big secret, a mystery to be revealed. Eloise loved that sort of thing.
Penelope looked to Colin in confusion, but he was apparently taking her instructions to heart, and his mouth was clamped firmly shut. Eloise, Penelope began. Eloise smiled, a bit, just at the corners, as if she wanted to smile more. Yes, Penelope cleared her throat. Eloise, she said again, there is something I must tell you. Really? Penelope's eyes narrowed. Surely the moment did not call for sarcasm. She took a breath, tamping down the urge to fire off an equally dry rejoinder, and said, "I did not wish to tell you on your wedding day." At this she speared her husband with a glare, "but it seems I have no choice." Eloise blinked a few times, but other than that, her placid demeanor did not change. "I can think of no other way to say it," Penelope plodded on, feeling positively sick. "But while you were gone, that is to say, the night you left, as a matter of fact," Eloise leaned forward. The movement was slight, but Penelope caught it, and for a moment she thought, well, she didn't think anything clearly, certainly nothing that she could have expressed in a proper sentence. But she did get a feeling of unease, a different sort of unease than the one she was already feeling. It was a suspicious sort of unease, and "I am Whistledown," she blurted out, because if she waited any longer, she thought her brain might explode. And Eloise said, "I know." Penelope sat down on the nearest solid object, which happened to be a table. "You know?" Eloise shrugged. "I know." "How?" "Hyacinth told me." "What?" This from Colin, looking fit to be tied. Or perhaps more accurately, fit to tie Hyacinth. "I'm sure she's at the door," Eloise murmured, with a nod, "in case you want to—" But Colin was one step ahead of her, wrenching open the door to the small salon. Sure enough, Hyacinth tumbled in. "Hyacinth?" Penelope said, disapprovingly. "Oh, please," Hyacinth retorted, smoothing her skirts. "You didn't think I wouldn't eavesdrop, did you? You know me better than that." "I'm going to wring your neck," Colin ground out. "We had a deal." Hyacinth shrugged. "I don't really need £20, as it happens. I already gave you 10. "I know," Hyacinth said with a cheerful smile. "Hyacinth!" Eloise exclaimed. "Which isn't to say," Hyacinth continued modestly, "that I don't want the other 10. She told me last night," Eloise explained, her eyes narrowing dangerously, "but only after informing me that she knew who Lady Whistledown was, and in fact the whole of society knew, but that the knowledge would cost me £25. "Did it not occur to you," Penelope asked, "that if the whole of society knew, that you could simply have asked someone else?" "The whole of society wasn't in my bedchamber at 2 in the morning," Eloise snapped. "I am thinking of buying a hat," Hyacinth mused. "Or maybe a pony." Eloise shot her a nasty look, then turned to Penelope. "Are you really Whistledown?" "I am," Penelope admitted, or rather, she looked over at Colin, not exactly sure why she was doing so, except that she loved him so much, and he knew her so well, and when he saw her helpless little wobbly smile, he would smile in return, no matter how irate he was with Hyacinth. And he did. Somehow, amidst everything, he knew what she needed. He always did. Penelope turned back to Eloise. "I was," she amended, "no longer. I've retired." But, of course, Eloise already knew that. Lady Y's letter of retirement had circulated long before Eloise had left town. "For good," Penelope added. "People have asked, but I shan't be induced to pick up my quill again." She paused, thinking of the scribblings she'd embarked upon at home. At least, not as Whistledown. She looked at Eloise, who had sat down next to her on the table. Her face was somewhat blank, and she hadn't said anything in ages. Well, ages for Eloise at least. Penelope tried to smile. "I am thinking of writing a novel, actually." Still nothing from Eloise, although she was blinking quite rapidly, and her brow was scrunched up as if she were thinking quite hard. And so Penelope took one of her hands and said the one thing she was really feeling. "I'm sorry, Eloise." Eloise had been staring rather blankly at an end table, but at that she turned, her eyes finding Penelope's. "You're sorry?" she echoed, and she sounded dubious,
as if sorry couldn't possibly be the correct emotion, or at least not enough of it. Penelope's heart sank. "I'm so sorry," she said again. "I should have told you. I should have—" "Are you mad?" Eloise asked, finally seeming to snap to attention. "Of course you should not have told me. I could never have kept this a secret." Penelope thought it rather remarkable of her to admit it. "I am so proud of you," Eloise continued. "Forget the writing for a moment. I cannot even fathom the logistics of it all. And someday, when it is not my wedding day, I shall insist upon hearing every last detail." "You were surprised, then?" Penelope murmured. Eloise gave her a rather dry look. "To put it mildly, I had to get her a chair," Hyacinth supplied. "I was already sitting down," Eloise ground out. Hyacinth waved her hand in the air. "Nevertheless—" "Ignore her," Eloise said, focusing firmly on Penelope. "Truly, I cannot begin to tell you how impressed I am, now that I've got over the shock, that is. Really? It hadn't occurred to Penelope until that very moment just how much she'd wished for Eloise's approval. Keeping us all in the dark for so long," Eloise said, shaking her head with slow admiration. "From me, from her." She jabbed a finger in Hyacinth's direction. "It's really very well done of you." At that she leaned forward and embraced Penelope in a warm hug. "You're not angry with me?" Eloise moved back and opened her mouth, and Penelope could see that she'd been about to say no, probably to be followed by "Of course not." But the words remained in Eloise's mouth, and she just sat there looking slightly thoughtful and surprised, until she finally said no. Penelope felt her brows lift. "Are you certain?" Because Eloise didn't sound certain. She didn't much sound like Eloise, to be honest. "It would be different if I were still in London," Eloise said quietly, with nothing else to do. "But this—" She glanced around the room, gesturing rather vaguely toward the window. "Here, it's just not the same. It's a different life," she said quietly. "I'm a different person, a little bit, at least." "Lady Crane," Penelope reminded her. Eloise smiled. "Good of you to remind me of that, Mrs. Bridgerton." Penelope almost laughed. "Can you believe it? Of you or me?" Eloise asked. "Both." Colin, who had been keeping a respectful distance, one hand firmly clamped around Hyacinth's arm to keep her at a respectful distance, stepped forward. "We should probably return," he said quietly. He held out his hand and helped first Penelope, then Eloise to her feet. "You," he said, leaning forward to kiss his sister on the cheek, "should certainly return." Eloise smiled wistfully, the blushing bride once again, and nodded. With one last squeeze of Penelope's hands, she brushed past Hyacinth, rolling her eyes as she did so, and made her way back to her wedding party. Penelope watched her go, linking her arm in Colin's, and leaned gently into him. They both stood there in contented silence, idly watching the now empty doorway, listening to the sounds of the party wafting through the air. "Do you think it would be polite if we left?" he murmured. "Probably not." "Do you think Eloise would mind?" Penelope shook her head. Colin's arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips gently brush her ear. "Let's go," he said. She did not argue. On the 25th of May, in the year 1824, precisely one day after the wedding of Eloise Bridgerton to Sir Philip Crane, 3 missives were delivered to the room of Mr. and Mrs. Colin Bridgerton, guests at the Rose and Bramble Inn near Tetbury, Gloucestershire. They arrived together. All were from Romney Hall. "Which shall we open first?" Penelope asked, spreading them before her on the bed. Colin yanked off the shirt he'd donned to answer the knock. "I defer to your good judgment, as always."
As always? He crawled back into bed beside her. She was remarkably adorable when she was being sarcastic. He couldn't think of another soul who could carry that off. "As whenever it suits me," he amended. "Your mother, then," Penelope said, plucking one of the letters off the sheet. She broke open the seal and carefully unfolded the paper.
Colin watched as she read. Her eyes widened, then her brows rose, then her lips pinched slightly at the corners, as if she were smiling despite herself. "What does she have to say?" he asked. "She forgives us. I don't suppose it would make any sense for me to ask for what." Penelope gave him a stern look. "For leaving the wedding early. You told me Eloise wouldn't mind. And I'm sure she did not. But this is your mother. Write back and assure her that should she ever remarry, I will stay to the bitter end." "I will do no such thing," Penelope replied, rolling her eyes. "I don't think she expects a reply, in any case." Really? Now he was curious, because his mother always expected replies. What did we do to earn her forgiveness, then? She mentioned something about the timely delivery of grandchildren." Colin grinned. "Are you blushing?" "No, you are." She elbowed him in the ribs. "I'm not. Here, read it yourself if you are so inclined." "I shall read Hyanthus." "I don't suppose she returned my £10, Colin grumbled. Penelope unfolded the paper and shook it out. Nothing fluttered down. "That minx is lucky she's my sister," he muttered. "What a bad sport you are," Penelope chided. "She bested you, and rather brilliantly, too." "Oh, please," he scoffed. "I did not see you praising her cunning yesterday afternoon." She waved off his protests. "Yes, well, some things are more easily seen in hindsight." "What does she have to say?" Colin asked, leaning over her shoulder. Knowing Hyacinth, it was probably some scheme to extort more money from his pockets. "It's rather sweet, actually," Penelope said. "Nothing nefarious at all." "Did you read both sides?" Colin asked dubiously. "She only wrote on one side." "Uncharacteristically uneconomical of her," he added, with suspicion. "Oh, heavens, Colin, it is just an account of the wedding after we left, and I must say she has a superior eye for humor and detail. She would have made a fine Whistledown. God help us all." The last letter was from Eloise, and unlike the other two, it was addressed to Penelope alone. Colin was curious, of course, who wouldn't be? But he moved away to allow Penelope her privacy. Her friendship with his sister was something he held in both awe and respect. He was close to his brothers, extremely so, but he had never seen a bond of friendship quite so deep as that between Penelope and Eloise. "Oh," Penelope let out as she turned a page. Eloise's missive was a good deal longer than the previous two, and she'd managed to fill 2 sheets, front and back. "That minx! What did she do?" Colin asked. "Oh, it was nothing," Penelope replied, even though her expression was rather peeved. "You weren't there, but the morning of the wedding she kept apologizing for keeping secrets, and it never even occurred to me that she was trying to get me to admit to keeping secrets of my own. Made me feel wretched, she did." Her voice trailed off as she read through another page. Colin leaned back against the fluffy pillows, his eyes resting on his wife's face. He liked watching her eyes move from left to right, following the words. He liked watching her lips move as she smiled or frowned. It was rather amazing, actually, how contented he felt, simply watching his wife read. Until she gasped, that was, and turned utterly white. He shoved himself up on his elbows. "What is it?" Penelope shook her head and groaned. "Oh, she is devious." "Privacy be damned." He grabbed the letter. "What did she say?" "Down there," Penelope said, pointing miserably at the bottom. "At the end." Colin brushed her finger away and began to read. "Good Lord, she's wordy," he muttered. "I can't make heads or tails of it." "Revenge," Penelope said. "She says my secret was bigger than hers." It was. "She says she's owed a boon." Colin pondered that. "She probably is. To even the score." He patted her hand. "I'm afraid that's how we Bridgertons think. You've never played a sporting game with us, have you?" Penelope moaned. "She said she is going to consult Hyanthus." Colin felt the blood leave his face. "I know," Penelope said, shaking her head. "We'll never be safe again." Colin slid his arm around her and pulled her close. "Didn't we say we wanted to visit Italy or India?" He smiled and kissed her on the nose. "Or we could just stay here, at the Rose and Bramble. We're supposed to depart tomorrow morning. It's the last place Hyanthus would look." Penelope glanced up at him, her eyes growing warm and perhaps just a little bit mischievous. "I have no pressing engagements in London for at least a fortnight." They came together in passion. He smiled against her skin. "Your servant, Mrs. Bridgerton. Always." At the age of 10, Miss Miranda Cheever showed no signs of great beauty. Her hair was brown, lamentably, as were her eyes, and her legs, which were uncommonly long, refused to learn anything that could be remotely called grace. Her mother often remarked that she positively loped around the house. Unfortunately for Miranda, the society into which she was born placed great stock on female appearance. And although she was only 10, she knew that in this regard she was considered inferior to most of the other little girls who lived nearby. Children have a way of finding these things out, usually from other children. Just such an unpleasant incident occurred at the 11th birthday party of Lady Olivia and the Honourable Winston Bevilstoke, twin children of the Earl and Countess of Rutland. Miranda's home was quite close to Haverbrakes, the Rutlands' ancestral home near Ambleside, in the Lake District of Cumberland. And she had always shared lessons with Olivia and Winston when they were in residence. They had become quite an inseparable threesome, and rarely bothered to play with the other children in the area, most of whom lived nearly an hour's ride away. But a dozen or so times a year, and especially on birthdays, all the children of the local nobility and gentry gathered together. It was for this reason that Lady Rutland let out a most unladylike groan. 18 urchins were gleefully tramping mud through her sitting-room after the twins' party in the garden was disrupted by rain. "You've mud on your cheek, Livy," Miranda said, reaching out to wipe it away. Olivia let out a dramatically weary sigh. "I'd best go to the washroom, then. I shouldn't want Mamma to see me thus. She quite abhors dirt, and I quite abhor listening to her tell me how much she abhors it. I don't see how she will have time to object to a little mud on your face when she's got it all over the carpet." Miranda glanced over at William Evans, who let out a war cry and cannonballed onto the sofa. She pursed her lips, otherwise she'd smile. "And the furniture. All the same, I had best go do something about it." She slipped out of the room, leaving Miranda near the doorway. Miranda watched the commotion for a minute or so, quite content to be in her usual spot as an observer, until, out of the corner of her eye, she saw someone approaching. "What did you bring Olivia for her birthday, Miranda?" Miranda turned to see Fiona Bennet standing before her, prettily dressed in a white frock with a pink sash. "A book," she replied. "Olivia likes to read. What did you bring?" Fiona held up a gaily painted box tied with a silver cord. "A collection of ribbons, silk and satin and even velvet. Do you want to see?" "Oh, but I wouldn't want to ruin the wrapping." Fiona shrugged. "All you need to do is untie the cord carefully. I do it every Christmas." She slipped off the cord and lifted the lid. Miranda caught her breath. At least 24 ribbons lay on the black velvet of the box. "They're beautiful, Fiona. May I see one?" Fiona narrowed her eyes. "I haven't any mud on my hands. See?" Miranda held her hands up for inspection. "Oh, very well." Miranda reached down and picked up a violet ribbon. The satin felt sinfully sleek and soft in her hands. She placed the bow coquettishly against her hair. "What do you think?" Fiona rolled her eyes. "Not violet, Miranda. Everyone knows they are for blonde hair. The color practically disappears against brown. You certainly can't wear one." Miranda handed the ribbon back to her. "What color suits brown hair? Green? My mamma has brown hair, and I've seen her wear green ribbons." "Green would be acceptable, I suppose, but it's better in blonde hair. Everything's better in blonde hair. Miranda felt a spark of indignation rising within her. "Well, I don't know what you're going to do then, Fiona, because your hair is as brown as mine." Fiona drew back in a huff. "It is not. Is too. Is not." Miranda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing menacingly. "You had better take a look in the mirror when you go home, Fiona, because your hair is not blonde." Fiona put the violet ribbon back in its case and snapped the lid shut. "Well, it used to be blonde, whereas yours never was. And besides that, my hair is light brown, which everyone knows is better than dark brown, like yours." "There's nothing wrong with dark brown hair," Miranda protested. But she already knew that most of England didn't agree with her. "And, Fiona," added viciously, "you've got big lips." Miranda's hand flew to her mouth. She knew that she was not beautiful. She knew she wasn't even considered pretty, but she'd never noticed anything wrong with her lips before. She looked up at the smirking girl. "You have freckles!" she burst out. Fiona drew back as if slapped. "Freckles fade. Mine shall be gone before I turn 18. My mother puts lemon juice on them every night." She sniffed disdainfully. "But there's no remedy for you, Miranda. You're ugly." "She is not." Both girls turned to see Olivia, who had returned from the washroom. "Oh, Olivia," Fiona said, "I know you are friends with Miranda because she lives so close by and shares your lessons, but she must admit she isn't very pretty. My mamma says she'll never get a husband." Olivia's blue eyes sparkled dangerously. The Earl of Rutland's only daughter had always been loyal to a fault, and Miranda was her best friend. "Miranda will get a better husband than you, Fiona Bennet. Her father's a baronet, whereas yours is a mere mister." "Being a baronet's daughter makes little difference unless one has looks or money," Fiona recited, repeating words she had obviously heard at home. "And Miranda has neither." "Be quiet, you silly old cow," Olivia exclaimed, stomping her foot on the ground. "This is my birthday party, and if you can't be nice, you may leave." Fiona gulped. She knew better than to alienate Olivia, whose parents held the highest rank in the area. "I'm sorry, Olivia," she mumbled. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to Miranda." "I'm sorry, Miranda." Miranda stayed silent until Olivia finally kicked her. "I accept your apology," she said grudgingly. Fiona nodded and ran off. "I can't believe you called her a silly old cow," Miranda said. "You must learn to stand up for yourself, Miranda. I was standing up for myself just fine before you came along, Livy." Olivia sighed. "Mamma says I haven't an ounce of restraint or common sense." "You don't," Miranda agreed. "Miranda! It's true, you don't, but I love you anyway. And I love you too, Miranda. And don't worry about silly old Fiona. You can marry Winston when you grow up, and then we'll be sisters truly." Miranda glanced across the room and eyed Winston dubiously. He was yanking on a little girl's hair. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I would wish to marry Winston." "Nonsense. It would be perfect. Besides, look, he just spilled punch on Fiona's dress." Miranda grinned. "Come with me," Olivia said, taking her hand. "I want to open my gifts. I promise I'll squeal the loudest when I get to yours." The two girls walked back into the room, and Olivia and Winston opened their gifts. Mercifully, in Lady Rutland's opinion, they finished at 4 o'clock on the button, which was the time that the children were meant to go home. Not a single child was picked up by servants. An invitation to Haverbreaks was considered quite an honor, and none of the parents wanted to miss the opportunity to hobnob with the Earl and Countess. None of the parents besides Miranda's, that was. At 5 o'clock she was still in the sitting-room, assessing the birthday booty with Olivia. "I can't imagine what has happened to your parents, Miranda," Lady Rutland said. "Oh, I can," Miranda replied cheerfully. "Mamma's gone to Scotland to visit her mamma, and I'm sure Papa has forgotten about me. He often does, you know, when he's working on a manuscript. He translates from the Greek." I know, Lady Rutland smiled. Ancient Greek. I know, Lady Rutland said on a sigh. This was not the first time Sir Rupert Cheever had misplaced his daughter. Well, you shall have to get home somehow. I'll go with her, Olivia suggested. You and Winston need to put away your new toys and write thank-you notes. If you don't do it tonight, you shan't remember who gave you what. But you can't send Miranda home with a servant. She'll have no one to talk to. I can talk to the servant, Miranda said. I always talk to the ones at home. Not ours, Olivia whispered. They're starched and silent, and they always look at me disapprovingly. Most of the time you deserve to be looked at disapprovingly, Lady Rutland interjected, giving her daughter a loving pat on the head. I have a treat for you, Miranda. Why don't we have Nigel bring you home? Nigel, Olivia squealed. Miranda, you lucky duck. Miranda raised her brows. She had never met Olivia's older brother. All right, she said slowly. I should like to finally meet him. You talk about him so often, Olivia. Lady Rutland summoned a maid to fetch him. You've never met him, Miranda? How odd. Well, I suppose he's usually only home at Christmas, and you always go to Scotland for the holiday. I had to threaten to cut him off to get him home for the twins' birthday. As it was, he wouldn't attend the party for fear that one of the mammas would try to marry him off to a 10-year-old. Nigel is 19, and he is very eligible, Olivia said, matter-of-factly. He's a Viscount, and he's very handsome. He looks just like me. Olivia, Lady Rutland said reprovingly. Well, he does, Mamma. I should be very handsome if I were a boy. You're quite pretty as a girl, Livy, Miranda said loyally, eyeing her friend's blonde locks with just a little envy. So are you. Here, pick one of Fiona Cow's ribbons. I don't need them all anyway. Miranda smiled at her lie. Olivia was such a good friend. She looked down at the ribbons and perversely chose the violet satin. Thank you, Livy. I shall wear it to lessons on Monday. You called, Mother? At the sound of the deep voice, Miranda turned her face to the doorway and almost gasped. There stood quite the most splendid creature she had ever beheld. Olivia had said that Nigel was 19, but Miranda immediately recognized him as the man he already was. His shoulders were marvelously broad, and the rest of him was lean and firm. His hair was darker than Olivia's, but still streaked with gold, attesting to time spent out in the sun. But the best part about him, Miranda immediately decided, was his eyes, which were bright, bright blue, just like Olivia's. They twinkled just as mischievously, too. Miranda smiled. Her mother always said that one could tell a person by his eyes, and Olivia's brother had very good eyes. Nigel, would you please be so kind as to escort Miranda home? Lady Rutland asked. Her father seems to have been detained. Miranda wondered why he winced when she said his name. Certainly, Mother. Olivia, did you have a good party? Smashing! Where is Winston? Olivia shrugged. He's off playing with the saber Billy Evans gave him. Not a real one, I hope. God help us if it is, Lady Rutland put in.
All right, Miranda, let's get you home. I believe your cloak is in the next room. She disappeared through the doorway and emerged a few seconds later with Miranda's serviceable brown coat. Shall we be off, Miranda? The godlike creature held out his hand to her. Miranda shrugged on her coat and placed her hand in his. Heaven! I will see you on Monday, Olivia called out. And don't worry about what Fiona said. She's just a silly old cow. Olivia? Well, she is, Mamma. I don't want to have her back. Miranda smiled as she let Olivia's brother lead her down the hall, Olivia's and Lady Rutland's voices slowly fading away. Thank you very much for taking me home, Nigel, she said softly. He winced again. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I ought to be calling you my lord, oughtn't I? It's just that Olivia and Winston always refer to you by your given name, and She cast miserable eyes toward the floor. Only 2 minutes in his splendid company, and already she'd blundered. He stopped and crouched down so that she could see his face. Don't worry about the my lord, Miranda. I'll tell you a secret. Miranda's eyes widened, and she forgot to breathe. "I despise my given name." "That's not much of a secret, Nigel. My lord. Whatever you wish to be called. You wince every time your mother says it." He smiled down at her. Something had tugged at his heart when he saw this little girl with the too serious expression playing with his indomitable sister. She was a funny-looking little creature, but there was something quite lovable about her big, soulful brown eyes. "What are you called?" Miranda asked. He smiled at her direct manner. "Turner." For a moment he thought she might not answer. She just stood there, utterly still, save for the blinking of her eyes. And then, as if finally reaching a conclusion, she said, "That's a nice name. A bit odd, but I like it. Much better than Nigel, don't you think?" Miranda nodded. "Did you choose it? I've often thought that people ought to choose their own names. I should think that most people would choose something different from what they have. And what would you choose?" "I'm not certain, but not Miranda. Something plainer, I think. People expect something different from a Miranda and are almost always disappointed when they meet me." "Nonsense," Turner said briskly. "You are a perfect Miranda." She beamed. "Thank you, Turner. May I call you that?" "Of course." "And I didn't choose it, I'm afraid. It's just a courtesy title. Viscount Turner. I've been using it in place of Nigel since I went to Eton." "Oh, it suits you, I think." "Thank you," he said gravely, completely entranced by this serious child. "Now, give me your hand again, and we shall be on our way." He had held out his left hand to her. Miranda quickly moved the ribbon from her right hand to her left. "What's that?" "This? Oh, a ribbon. Fiona Bennet gave 24 of them to Olivia, and Olivia said I might keep one." Turner's eyes narrowed ever so slightly as he remembered Olivia's parting words. "Don't worry about what Fiona said." He plucked the ribbon out of her hand. "Ribbons belong in hair, I think." "Oh, but it doesn't match my dress," Miranda said in feeble protest. He'd already fastened it atop her head. "How does it look?" she whispered. "Smashing." "Really?" Her eyes widened doubtfully. "Really. I've always thought that violet ribbons look especially nice with brown hair." Miranda fell in love on the spot. So intense was the feeling that she quite forgot to thank him for the compliment. "Shall we be off?" he said. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They made their way out of the house and to the stables. "I thought we might ride," Turner said. "It's far too nice a day for a carriage." Miranda nodded again. It was uncommonly warm for March. "You can take Olivia's pony. I'm sure she won't mind." "Livy hasn't got a pony," Miranda said, finally finding her voice. "She has a mare now. I've one at home, too. We're not babies, you know." Turner suppressed a smile. "No, I can see that you are not. How silly of me. I wasn't thinking." A few minutes later, their horses were saddled, and they set off on the 15-minute ride to the Cheever home. Miranda stayed silent for the first minute or so, too perfectly happy to spoil the moment with words. "Did you have a good time at the party?" Turner finally asked. "Oh, yes, most of it was just lovely." "Most of it?" He saw her wince. Obviously, she hadn't meant to say so much. "Well," she said slowly, catching her lip between her teeth and then letting it go before continuing, "one of the girls said some unkind words to me." "Oh?" He knew better than to be overly inquisitive, and obviously he was right, because when she spoke, she rather reminded him of his sister, staring up at him with frank eyes as her words spilled firmly from her mouth. "It was Fiona Bennet," she said with great distaste, "and Olivia called her a silly old cow, and I must say I'm not sorry that she did." Turner kept his expression appropriately grave. "I'm not sorry that she did either, if Fiona said unkind things to you." "I know I'm not pretty," Miranda burst out, "but it's dreadfully impolite to say so, not to mention downright mean." Turner looked at her for a long moment, not exactly sure how to comfort the little girl. She wasn't beautiful, that was true, and if he tried to tell her that she was, she wouldn't believe him. But she wasn't ugly. She was just rather awkward. He was saved, however, from having to say anything by Miranda's next comment.
"It's this brown hair, I think." He raised his brows. "It's not at all fashionable," Miranda explained. "And neither are brown eyes. And I'm too skinny by half, and my face is too long, and I'm far too pale." "Well, that's all true," Turner said. Miranda turned to face him, her eyes looming large and sad in her face. "You certainly do have brown hair and eyes. There is no use arguing that point." He tilted his head and pretended to give her a complete inspection. "You are rather thin, and your face is indeed a trifle long, and you certainly are pale." Her lips trembled, and Turner could tease her no more. "But, as it happens," he said with a smile, "I myself prefer women with brown hair and eyes. You don't?" "I do. I always have. And I like them thin and pale as well." Miranda eyed him suspiciously. "What about long faces?" "Well, I must admit, I never gave the matter much thought, but I certainly don't mind a long face." "Fiona Bennet said I have big lips," she said almost defiantly. Turner bit back a smile. She heaved a great sigh. "I never even noticed I had big lips before. They're not so big." She shot him a wary glance. "You're just saying that to make me feel better." "I do want you to feel better, but that's not why I said it. And next time Fiona Bennet says you have big lips, tell her she's wrong. You have full lips." "What's the difference?" She looked over at him patiently, her dark eyes serious. Turner took a breath. "Well," he stalled, "big lips are unattractive. Full lips are not." "Oh." That seemed to satisfy her. "Fiona has thin lips. Full lips are much, much better than thin lips," Turner said emphatically. He quite liked this funny little girl and wanted her to feel better. "Why?" Turner offered up a silent apology to the gods of etiquette and propriety before he answered. "Full lips are better for kissing." "Oh." Miranda blushed, and then she smiled. "Good." Turner felt absurdly pleased with himself. "Do you know what I think, Miss Miranda Cheever?" "What?" "I think you just need to grow into yourself." The minute he said it, he was sorry. She would surely ask him what he meant, and he had no idea how to answer her. But the precocious little child simply tilted her head to one side as she pondered her statement. "I expect you're right," she finally said. "Just look at my legs." A discreet cough masked the chuckle that welled up in Turner's throat. "What do you mean?" "Well, they're far too long. Mamma always says that they start at my shoulders." "They appear to begin quite properly at your waist, to me." Miranda giggled. "I was speaking metaphorically." Turner blinked.
This 10-year-old had quite a vocabulary, indeed. "What I meant," she went on, "is that my legs are all the wrong size compared to the rest of me. I think that's why I can't seem to learn how to dance. I'm forever trotting on Olivia's toes." "On Olivia's toes?" "We practice together," Miranda explained briskly. "I think that if the rest of me catches up with my legs, I won't be so clumsy. So I think you're right. I do have to grow into myself." "Splendid," Turner said, happily aware that he had somehow managed to say exactly the right thing. "Well, we seem to have arrived." Miranda looked up at the gray stone house that was her home. It was located right on one of the many streams that connected the lakes of the district, and one had to cross over a little cobbled bridge just to reach the front door. "Thank you very much for taking me home, Turner. I promise I'll never call you Nigel. Will you also promise to pinch Olivia if she calls me Nigel?" Miranda let out a little giggle and clapped her hand to her mouth. She nodded. Turner dismounted and then turned to the little girl and helped her down. "Do you know what I think you should do, Miranda?" he said suddenly. "What?" "I think you ought to keep a journal." She blinked in surprise. "Why? Who would want to read it?" "No one, silly. You keep it for yourself. And maybe someday, after you die, your grandchildren will read it, so they will know what you were like when you were young." She tilted her head. "What if I don't have grandchildren?" Turner impulsively reached out and tousled her hair.
You ask a lot of questions, Puss. But what if I don't have grandchildren? Lord, she was persistent. Perhaps you'll be famous, he sighed, and the children who study about you in school will want to know about you. Miranda shot him a doubtful look. Oh, very well. Do you want to know why I really think you should keep a journal? She nodded. Because someday you're going to grow into yourself, and you will be as beautiful as you already are smart. And then you can look back into your diary and realize just how silly little girls like Fiona Bennet are. And you'll laugh when you remember that your mother said your legs started at your shoulders. And maybe you'll save a little smile for me when you remember the nice chat we had today. Miranda looked up at him, thinking that he must be one of those Greek gods her father was always reading about. "Do you know what I think?" she whispered. "I think Olivia is very lucky to have you for a brother. And I think she is very lucky to have you for a friend." Miranda's lips trembled. "I shall save a very big smile for you, Turner," she whispered. He leaned down and graciously kissed the back of her hand as he would the most beautiful lady in London. "See that you do, Puss." He smiled and nodded before he got on his horse, leading Olivia's mare behind him. Miranda stared at him until he disappeared over the horizon, and then she stared for a good 10 minutes more. Later that night, Miranda wandered into her father's study. He was bent over a text, oblivious to the candle wax that was dripping onto his desk. "Papa, how many times do I have to tell you that you need to watch the candles?" She sighed and put the candle in a proper holder. "What? Oh, dear. And you need more than one. It's far too dark in here to read." "Is it? I hadn't noticed." He blinked and then narrowed his eyes. "Isn't it past your bedtime? Nanny said I could stay up an extra 30 minutes tonight." "Did she? Well, whatever she says then." He bent over his manuscript again, effectively dismissing her. "Papa?" He sighed. "What is it, Miranda? Do you have an extra notebook, like the ones you use when you're translating, but before you copy out your final draft?" "I suppose so." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and rummaged through it. "Here we are. But what do you wish to do with it? That's a quality notebook, you know, and not cheap." "I'm going to keep a journal." "Are you now? Well, that's a worthy endeavor, I suppose." He handed the notebook to her. Miranda beamed at her father's praise. "Thank you. I shall let you know when I run out of space and need another." "All right, then. Good night, dear." He turned back to his papers. Miranda hugged the notebook to her chest and ran up the stairs to her bedroom. She took out a pot of ink and a quill and opened the book to the first page. She wrote the date, and then, after considerable thought, wrote a single sentence. It was all that seemed necessary. 2 March 1810. Today I fell in love. Nigel Bevilstoke, better known as Turner to all who cared to court his favour, knew a great many things. He knew how to read Latin and Greek, and he knew how to seduce a woman in French and Italian. He knew how to shoot a moving target while atop a moving horse, and he knew exactly how much he could drink before surrendering his dignity. He could throw a punch or fence with a master, and he could do them both while reciting Shakespeare or Donne. In short, he knew everything a gentleman ought to know, and, by all accounts, he'd excelled in every area. People looked at him, people looked up to him, but nothing, not 1 second of his prominent and privileged life had prepared him for this moment. And never had he felt the weight of watchful eyes so much as now, as he stepped forward and tossed a clump of dirt on the coffin of his wife. "I'm so sorry," people kept saying. "I'm so sorry. We're so sorry." And all the while Turner could not help to wonder if God might smite him down, because all he could think was, "I'm not." Ah, Letitia. He had quite a lot to thank her for. Let's see, where to start. There was the loss of his reputation, of course. The devil only knew how many people were aware that he'd been cuckolded, repeatedly. Then there was the loss of his innocence. It was difficult to recall now, but he had once given mankind the benefit of the doubt. He had, on the whole, believed the best of people, that if he treated others with honor and respect, they would do the same unto him. And then there was the loss of his soul. Because as he stepped back, clasping his hands stiffly behind him as he listened to the priest commit Letitia's body to the ground, he could not escape the fact that he had wished for this. He had wanted to be rid of her, and he did not mourn her. Such a pity, someone behind him whispered. Turner's jaw twitched. This was not a pity, it was a farce. And now he would spend the next year wearing black for a woman who had come to him carrying another man's child. She had bewitched him, teased him until he could think of nothing but the possession of her. She had said she loved him, and she had smiled with sweet innocence and delight when he had avowed his devotion and pledged his soul. She had been his dream, and then she had been his nightmare. She'd lost that baby, the one that had prompted their marriage. The father had been some Italian count, or at least that's what she'd said. He was married, or unsuitable, or maybe both. Turner had been prepared to forgive her. Everyone made mistakes, and hadn't he too wanted to seduce her before their wedding night? But Letitia had not wanted his love. He didn't know what the hell she had wanted. Power, perhaps, the heady rush of satisfaction when yet another man fell under her spell. Turner wondered if she'd felt that when he'd succumbed. Or maybe it had just been relief. She'd been 3 months along by the time they married. She hadn't much time to spare. And now here she was. Or rather, there she was. Turner wasn't precisely sure which locational pronoun was more accurate for a lifeless body in the ground. Whichever. He was only sorry that she would spend her eternity in his ground, resting among the Bevilstokes of days gone by. Her stone would bear his name, and in 100 years someone would gaze upon the etchings in the granite and think she must have been a fine lady, and what a tragedy that she'd been taken so young. Turner looked up at the priest. He was a youngish fellow, new to the parish, and by all accounts still convinced that he could make the world a better place. "Ashes to ashes," the priest said, and he looked up at the man who was meant to be the bereaved widower. Ah, yes, thought acerbically, that would be me. Dust to dust. Behind him, someone actually sniffled. And the priest, his blue eyes bright with that appallingly misplaced glimmer of sympathy, kept on talking. In the sure and certain hope of the resurrection, good God, to eternal life. The priest looked at Turner and actually flinched. Turner wondered what, exactly, he'd seen in his face. Nothing good, that much was clear. There was a chorus of amens, and then the service was over. Everyone looked at the priest, and then everyone looked at Turner, and then everyone looked at the priest clasping Turner's hands in his own as he said, "She will be missed." Not, Turner bit off, by me. I can't believe he said that. Miranda looked down at the words she'd just written. She was currently on page 42 of her 13th journal, but this was the first time since that fateful day 9 years earlier, that she had not a clue what to write. Even when her days were dull, and they frequently were, she managed to cobble together an entry. In May of her 14th year, woke, dressed, ate breakfast, toast, eggs, bacon. Read Sense and Sensibility, authored by unknown lady. Hid Sense and Sensibility from father. Ate dinner, chicken, bread, cheese. Conjugated French verbs. Composed letter to grandmother. Ate supper, beefsteak, soup, pudding. Read more Sense and Sensibility. Author's identity still unknown. Retired. Slept. Dreamed of him. This was not to be confused with her entry of 12 November of the same year. Woke. Ate breakfast. Eggs, toast, ham. Made great show of reading Greek tragedy. To no avail. Spent much of the time staring out the window. Ate lunch. Fish, bread, peas. Conjugated Latin verbs. Composed letter to grandmother. Ate supper. Roast, potatoes, pudding. Brought tragedy to the table, book, not event. Father did not notice. Retired. Slept. Dreamed of him. But now when something huge and momentous had actually occurred, which it never did, she had nothing to say except, "I can't believe he said that." "Well, Miranda," she murmured, watching the ink dry on the tip of her quill, "you'll not achieve fame as a diarist." "What did you say?" Miranda snapped her diary shut. She had not realized that Olivia had entered the room. "Nothing," she said quickly. Olivia moved across the carpet and flopped on the bed. "What a horrible day!" Miranda nodded, twisting in her seat so that she was facing her friend. "I am glad you were here," Olivia said with a sigh. "Thank you for remaining for the night." "Of course," Miranda replied. There had been no question, not when Olivia had said she'd needed her. "What are you writing?" Miranda looked down at the diary, only just then realizing that her hands were resting protectively across its cover. "Nothing," she said. Olivia had been staring at the ceiling, but at that she quirked her head in Miranda's direction. "That can't be true." "Sadly, it is." "Why is it sad?" Miranda blinked. Trust Olivia to ask the most obvious questions, and the ones with the least obvious answers. "Well," Miranda said, not precisely stalling for time. Really, it was more that she was figuring it all out as she went. She moved her hands and looked down at the journal, as if the answer might have magically inscribed itself onto the cover. "This, all I have. It is what I am." Olivia looked dubious. "It's a book. It's my life. Why is it," Olivia opined, "that people call me dramatic?" "I'm not saying it is my life," Miranda said with a flash of impatience, "just that it contains it. Everything. I have written everything down, since I was 10. Everything? Miranda thought of the many days she'd dutifully recorded what she'd eaten, and little else. Everything. I could never keep a journal. No. Olivia rolled onto her side, propping her head up with her hand. "You needn't have agreed with me so quickly." Miranda only smiled. Olivia flopped back down. "I suppose you are going to write that I have a short attention span." "I already have." Silence, then, "Really? I believe I said you bored easily." "Well," her friend replied, with only the barest moment of reflection, "that much is true." Miranda looked back down at the writing desk. Her candle was shedding flickers of light on the blotter, and she suddenly felt tired. Tired, but unfortunately not sleepy. Weary, perhaps. Restless. "I'm exhausted," Olivia declared, sliding off the bed. Her maid had left her nightclothes atop the covers, and Miranda respectfully turned her head while Olivia changed into them. "How long do you think Turner will remain here in the country?" Miranda asked, trying not to bite her tongue. She hated that she was still so desperate for a glimpse of him, but it had been this way for years. Even when he'd married, and she'd sat in the pews at his wedding, and watching him watch his bride with all the love and devotion that burned in her own heart, she'd still watched. She still loved him. She always would. He was the man who'd made her believe in herself. He had no idea what he'd done to her, what he'd done for her, and he probably never would. But Miranda still ached for him, and she probably always would. Olivia crawled into bed. "Will you be up long?" she asked, her voice thick with the beginnings of slumber. "Not long," Miranda assured her. Olivia could not fall asleep while a candle burned so close. Miranda could not understand it, as the fire in the grate did not seem to bother her. But she had seen Olivia toss and turn with her own eyes, and so, when she realized that her mind was still racing, and not long had been a bit of a lie, she leaned forward and blew out the candle. "Il feichtch," Olivia mumbled, and by the time Miranda pulled on a wrapper and reached the corridor, she was asleep. Miranda tucked her journal under her chin and wedged it against her breastbone to free her hands so that she could tie the sash around her waist. She was a frequent overnight guest at Haverbreaks, but still it wouldn't do to be wandering the halls of someone else's home in nothing but her nightgown. It was a dark night, with nothing but the moonlight filtering through the windows to guide her. But Miranda could have made her way from Olivia's room to the library with her eyes closed. Olivia always fell asleep before she did. Too many thoughts rumbling about in her head, Olivia pronounced, and so Miranda frequently took her diary to another room to record her ponderings. She supposed she could have asked for a bedchamber of her own, but Olivia's mother did not believe in needless extravagance, and she saw no reason to heat 2 rooms when 1 would suffice. Miranda did not mind. In fact, she was grateful for the company. Her own home was far too quiet these days. Her beloved mother had passed away nearly a year earlier, and Miranda had been left alone with her father. In his grief, he had closeted himself away with his precious manuscripts, leaving his daughter to fend for herself. Miranda had turned to the Bevilstokes for love and friendship, and they welcomed her with open arms. Olivia even wore black for 3 weeks in honor of Lady Cheever. "If one of my first cousins died, I'd be forced to do the same," Olivia had said at the funeral, "and I certainly loved your mamma better than any of my cousins." "Olivia!" Miranda was touched, but nonetheless she thought she ought to be shocked. Olivia rolled her eyes. "Have you met my cousins?" And she'd laughed. At her own mother's funeral, Miranda had laughed. It was, she'd later realized, the most precious gift her friend could have offered. "I love you, Livy," she said. Olivia took her hand. "I know you do," she said softly. "And I you." Then she squared her shoulders and assumed her usual stance.
"I should be quite incorrigible without you, you know. My mother often says you are the only reason I have not committed some irredeemable offense." It was probably for that reason, Miranda reflected, that Lady Rutland had offered to sponsor her for a season in London. Upon receiving the invitation, her father had sighed with relief and quickly forwarded the necessary funds. Sir Rupert Cheever was not an exceptionally wealthy man, but he had enough to cover a season in London for his only daughter. What he did not possess was the necessary patience, or, to be frank, the interest to take her himself. Their debut was delayed for a year. Miranda could not go while in mourning for her mother, and Lady Rutland had decided to allow Olivia to wait as well. 20 would do as well as 19, she announced. And it was true. No one was worried about Olivia making a grand match. With her stunning looks, vivacious personality, and, as Olivia Riley pointed out, her hefty dowry, she was sure to be a success. But Letitia's death, in addition to being tragic, had been particularly ill-timed. Now there was another period of mourning to be observed. Olivia could get away with just 6 weeks, however, as Letitia had not been a sister in blood. They would be only a little bit late in their arrival for the season. It couldn't be helped. Secretly, Miranda was glad. The thought of a London ball positively terrified her. It wasn't that she was shy precisely, because she didn't think she was. It was just that she did not enjoy large crowds, and the thought of so many people staring at her in judgment was just awful. Can't be helped, she thought, as she made her way down the stairs. And at any rate, it would be far worse to be stuck out in Ambleside without Olivia for company. Miranda paused at the bottom of the stairs, deciding where to go. The west sitting room had the better desk, but the library tended to be warmer, and it was a bit of a chilly night. On the other hand, what was that? She leaned to the side, peering down the hall. Someone had a fire burning in Lord Rudland's study. Miranda couldn't imagine that anyone was still up and about. The Bevilstokes always retired early. She moved quietly along the runner carpet until she reached the open door. "Oh!" Turner looked up from his father's chair. "Miss Miranda," he drawled, not adjusting one muscle of his lazy sprawl. "Quelle surprise." Turner wasn't surprised to see Miss Miranda Cheever standing in the doorway of his father's study. When he'd heard footsteps in the hall, he'd somehow known it had to be she. True, his family tended to sleep like the dead, and it was almost inconceivable that one of them might be up and about, wandering the halls in search of a snack or something to read. But it had been more than the process of elimination that had led him to Miranda as the obvious choice. She was a watcher, that one, always there, always observing the scene with those owlish eyes of hers. He couldn't remember when he'd first met her, probably before the chit had been out of leading strings. She was a fixture, really, somehow always there, even at times like these, when it ought to have been only family. "I'll go," she said. "No, don't," he replied. Because why? Because he felt like mischief? Because he'd had too much to drink? "Stay," he said, waving his arm expansively. Surely there had to be somewhere else to sit in here. "Have a drink." Her eyes widened. "Didn't think they could get any bigger," he muttered. "I can't drink," she said. "Can't you?" "I shouldn't," she corrected, and he thought he saw her brows draw together. Good. He'd irritated her. It was good to know he could still provoke a woman, even one as unschooled as she. "You're here," he said with a shrug. "You might as well have a brandy." For a moment she held still, and he could swear he could hear her brain whirring. Finally, she set her little book on a table near the door and stepped forward. "Just one," she said. He smiled. "Because you know your limit?" Her eyes met his. "Because I don't know my limit." "Such wisdom in one so young," he murmured. "I'm 19, she said, not defiantly, just as a statement of fact. He lifted a brow. "As I said." "When you were 19, he smiled caustically, noticing that she did not finish the statement. "When I was 19, he repeated for her, handing her a liberal portion of brandy, "I was a fool." He looked at the glass he'd poured for himself, equal to Miranda's. He downed it in one long, satisfying gulp. The glass landed on the table with a clunk, and Turner leaned back, letting his head rest in his palms, his elbows bent out to the sides. "As are all 19-year-olds, I should add," he finished. He eyed her. She hadn't touched her drink. She hadn't even yet sat down. "Present company quite possibly excluded," he amended. "I thought brandy was meant to go in a snifter," she said. He watched as she moved carefully to a seat. It wasn't next to him, but it wasn't quite across from him either. Her eyes never left his, and he couldn't help but wonder what she thought he might do. Pounce? "Brandy," he announced, as if speaking to an audience that numbered more than one, "is best served in whatever one has handy. In this case—" He picked up his tumbler and regarded firelight dance along the facets. He didn't bother to finish his sentence. It didn't seem necessary, and besides, he was busy pouring himself another drink. Chairs. And down it went. He looked over at her. She was still just sitting there, watching him. He couldn't tell if she disapproved. Her expression was far too inscrutable for that. But he wished that she would say something. Anything would do, really. Even more nonsense about stemware would be enough to nudge his mind off the fact that it was still 11:30, and he had 30 more minutes to go before he could declare this wretched day over. "So tell me, Miss Miranda, how did you enjoy the service?" he asked, daring her with his eyes to say something beyond the usual platitudes. Surprise registered on her face, the first emotion of the night he was clearly able to discern. "You mean the funeral?" "Only service of the day," he said, with considerable jauntiness. "It was, interesting."
"Oh, come now, Miss Cheever, you can do better than that." She caught her lower lip between her teeth. "Letitia used to do that," he recalled, "back when she still pretended to be an innocent." It had stopped when his ring had been safely on her finger. He poured another drink. "Don't you think?" "No," he said forcefully. "There wasn't enough brandy in the world for a night like this." And then she reached forward, picked up her glass, and took a sip. "I thought you were splendid." He coughed and spluttered as if he were the innocent taking his first taste of brandy. "I beg your pardon." She smiled placidly. "It might help to take smaller sips." He glared at her. "It's rare that someone speaks honestly of the dead," she said. "I'm not certain that that was the most appropriate venue, but, well, she wasn't a terribly nice person, was she? She looked so serene, so innocent, but her eyes, they were sharp." "Why, Miss Cheever," he murmured, "I do believe you've a bit of a vindictive streak." She shrugged and took another sip of her drink, a small one, he noted. "Not at all," she said, although he was quite certain he did not believe her. "But I am a good observer." He chuckled. "Indeed." She stiffened. "I beg your pardon." Head ruffled her. He didn't know why he found this so satisfying, but he couldn't help but be pleased. And it had been so long since he'd been pleased about anything. He leaned forward, just to see if he could make her squirm. "I've been watching you." She paled. Even in the firelight he could see it. "Do you know what I've seen?" he murmured. Her lips parted, and she shook her head. "You have been watching me." She stood, the suddenness of the movement nearly knocking her chair over. "I should go," she said.
"This is highly irregular, and it's late. And oh, come now, Miss Cheever," he said, rising to his feet. "Don't fret. You watch everyone. Do you think I hadn't noticed?" He reached out and took her arm. She froze, but she didn't turn around. His fingers tightened, just a touch, just enough to keep her from leaving, because he didn't want her to leave. He didn't want to be alone. He had 20 more minutes, and he wanted her to be angry, just as he was angry, just as he'd been angry for years. "Tell me, Miss Cheever," he whispered, touching 2 fingers to the underside of her chin, "have you ever been kissed?"